Hello, people in West Campus. We are here to interview Henry Jenkins, the professor of communication, journalism, cinematic arts, and education at University of Southern California, and the founder and former co-director of MIT Comparative Media Studies program. He's the bestseller author of or editor of 20 books in various aspects of media and popular culture. Mr. Jenkins, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And my first question for you, it's about the situation of the media right now in the world and the share of the responsibility with the political situation in the world right now, including in Brazil, in the United States, this right-wing project. I think it's very correlated with media environment. What do you think about?
It's a complicated question. Let me begin by saying that I'm going to frame most of my answers in terms of American media context. I've been to Brazil. I love the people of Brazil, but I'm no expert on Brazilian media or Brazilian politics. So let me talk from my own perspective about what I think is going on here, and hopefully it'll be relevant to what's going on there. First, if we look at the news, I think in the United States, the news media has kept pumping Trump because his controversial comments were such grabbers, right? They were just something that traveled through social media. They were something that people wanted to stop and see. They were just fiery content. And as a result, the news media promoted Trump from the very beginning and gave him a disproportionate amount of airtime. It was slow to challenge his statements, right? It is difficult for an quote objective media, which always wants to say represent two sides in the American context, to call out a president who was clearly lying. Now it's fairly routine for the news media to use the phrase "the big lie" to refer to Trump's claims about the election, but throughout his administration, they soft-pedaled the problem that we were facing there. And as a result, what we should have been holding the power accountable was complicit with power, complacent about the consequences of its own coverage. Now, if we shift to the entertainment industry, it becomes more complicated, but more interesting, right? So the work we do with the Civic Imagination project started when we realized that young people, and particularly around the world, are drawing on popular culture as the raw materials from which they build their politics. They fight for social change in a vernacular heavily informed by wizards and zombies and handmaids and three-finger salutes and any number of other things that have all become political symbols. And the right wing does much the same. Right? So the red pill, blue pill distinction in the Matrix, for example, has been a really important one on the right in the United States. There's certain action film stars have emerged as symbols for the right. Game of Thrones became a symbol for the rights. Tolkien and other fantasy stories, particularly Nordic fantasy stories, are points of entry into far-right politics, particularly white supremacist politics in the United States. So insofar as the raw materials that we're conducting our politics through are coming from mass media, then the mass media faces new responsibilities for thinking about what those contents might be. Not that they control fully what the audience is, and this is not a liability question, it's an ethics question, right? Are you pumping things out into the system? Are you making Viking movies that are really extreme, celebrating a white supremacist agenda, which is pretty clearly known in the fantasy world what the problems with that are? Are you promoting diversity and inclusion? Are you expanding representation, or are you holding on to a white majority representation in American media? All of that has consequences. Now, what does the civic imagination do? Well, our model starts from the premise that before you can build a better world, you have to imagine what a better world looks like. And the vocabulary we have for looking at better worlds is heavily shaped by media. We have to imagine ourselves as civic agents capable of making change. So the discourse of empowerment and the role models we have for thinking about who we are and what we can do in the world are shaped heavily by media. Third, we have to imagine ourselves as part of a larger community of shared interest. Not the imagined community that some theorists have talked about, but the imagining community. How do we come together and imagine? And what are we building on when we imagine together our hopes, our aspirations, our fears about the future? We have to imagine a process of change. And if mass media only represents change through violence, that's going to increasingly be seen as the mechanism of change, right? We have to imagine shared interest or empathy for groups other than our own. And that's where representation becomes really important, and which group stories are being told through the media. And for those groups that are most marginalized and oppressed, they may well have to imagine freedom, dignity, participation before they've directly experienced it. And again, what does that look like is heavily shaped by the content of media. So what stories does our culture tell us about the civic? The civic understood not simply as the political, that is government power struggles, but how we relate to each other as members of a community. So I think about, in the US, there was a child show host program called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And Fred Rogers continually opened up this idea of who is a neighbor, and had all kinds of people come to his house as neighbors, including people of color very early in the early 60s, and continually expanded this notion of a neighbor to emphasize the connections members of a community have to each other. And this is not at all a political program, but it is a program that shaped the civic and the way a whole generation thought of themselves as civic agents. And that's the essence of what we're talking about when we talk about the civic imagination.
And tell us how during this process to construct the civic imagination project, you start to dialogue with industry, government, academy, how people receive your message.
Well, we start by going out and talking to communities, and we've probably done 60, 70 different communities across the US and other parts of the world over the last 3 or 4 years. And we do a world building process, a process where we come into a community and have a day-long set of activities that allow us to understand how the community is thinking. So we start with often people bring in a memory object, something from their lives that speaks to who they are, what their heritage is, what their trajectory has been, and they share that with each other. And this can be an enormously powerful process emotionally, because it all start out very intimately. We discover this is a necessary part of the process because for many people, the fear about the future is that they will lose things that they value. And so starting with the idea that they will carry with them something that's important to them is very reassuring and paves the way for part 2, which is world building. So we're thinking about what is the world of 2060, right? Not the world as we think it will be, because that's often very dark and dystopian, but the world that we hope it will be. What is the better world we would like to give to our children? And we brainstorm a variety of different topics and issues. Then we break down into groups and make up narratives about tipping points for change. So what is the moment we go from the world we're living in now, however dystopian we see it to be, and what happens next. And what we discover is often people need to imagine a meltdown, some horrible catastrophe that results in the possibilities of change shifting. And people see the urgent need for change or can imagine change because the old institutions have failed. And this is a question, is that the pandemic? Could the pandemic open the door for us to think about other possibilities? Is that a meltdown? Is the rise of fascism in Brazil and the United States and elsewhere a kind of meltdown moment for us? What does that look like? And then they perform those narratives for each other, and we discuss the mechanisms for change. Is it some tech billionaire who brings a technological solution which changes the world's problems? Is it bottom-up democracy? Is it top-down autocratic rule? What models do people have for thinking about positive change in the world? And in bringing those into context from, we worked with sex workers in Los Angeles to coal miners and tobacco farmers in Kentucky, and are getting these soundings from across America, extraordinary things we're learning. So now we're trying to take that out to other stakeholders. Government is still a hard nut to crack for us, to be honest. We're having a bit better luck getting the entertainment industry to think about it. And in some ways, that's where we see our most powerful starting point. I'm a media scholar. I'm not a political scientist. So talking to media industries has been natural for me throughout the last decade or so. And really having conversations about the stories that are out there now and what kinds of stories the public is telling about the world and what needs they have for resources to prod their imagination is an important discussion. And we are both working with entry-level independent media makers. We're going to launch a kind of incubator for creative people who are trying to imagine other possibilities through their work, and consulting with major media companies and franchises here in the United States is very much what we're doing. And we would love to broaden that experience that out to media companies in other parts of the world. I know I've spoken to Globo in the past multiple times now, and other Brazilian media companies we would love to hear from.
The entertainment industry is historically connected to the idea of soft power, defense, and national supremacy. As it gets more global, local industries are becoming more relevant.
Yes.
How does the Civic Imagination project understand this local culture phenomenon?
Well, I would say the current moment of streaming, Netflix, particularly, but other streaming companies, is creating what I would call a global shuffle. That is, we saw last year that Squid Games was the top viewed content in 60 countries around the world. We are watching each other's media, absorbing each other's stories. And so in a way that the North America has rarely experienced before, we are consuming media from elsewhere, and that is going to shape the way we see the world. That's really an important part of the current moment. Now it's driven by, on the one hand, immigrant communities, emigre communities seeking connections back to the mother country through media. It's driven by what I call Popcosmopolitanism, which is younger people seeking to escape the parochialism of their own culture by seeking out pop culture content from elsewhere that inspires a kind of cosmopolitan attitude about the world. And it's inspired by the economic underpinnings of a global streaming industry. So one way to think about Netflix is cultural imperialism, right? This is an American company that is shaping the agenda of media in countries around the world and therefore flooding the market with US media. But it's more complicated than that because it's also circulating media and funding the production of media in countries around the world. And it's discovering the value of those local differences. It's discovering that people want media that tells different stories, that has different sounds, different styles, different people represented. And so there's a diversification that's going on through Netflix right now that's at least as significant as the kind of old cultural imperialism model. Now, how does soft power work in this world, I think, is a really interesting question. Clearly, getting into the global circuit expands the influence of countries whose media is being consumed. So Korean debates about class, say, are traveling with Squid Games and all of the other, Parasite and all the other Korean pop culture we're seeing right now, or a particular kind of soft masculinity is traveling with K-pop at the moment. And there's every reason to think Brazil can be part of that process, right? And there certainly are some Brazilian shows that have made it into the Netflix and reached fairly high up in the Netflix world that are going to shape how people understand Brazil as a cultural producing and political power, but also will draw interest in local media production because of the Popcosmopolitanism. And Brazil seems to be a country particularly well situated with that because there's a Brazilian coolness that comes through in your popular music, for example. And there's a colorfulness that comes through the thriving folk cultures of Brazil. And I think those things make Brazil a country that could really play nicely in this global media shuffle that I'm talking about. And language barriers, like the fact that it's Portuguese, not Spanish, become less significant in a world where Netflix is covering the cost of dubbing, where audiences are more open to subtitles than ever before. There's a number of things going on that makes this moment a particularly interesting one to reconfiguring how soft power is going to work in this moment of the global media shuffle.
I just received the news that Netflix in Brazil lost 200,000 clients.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, Netflix has had
amazing.
A bad couple of month or two here in many countries around the world, but it's in part because these other streaming services have become more aggressive and more successful, and they are also producing global and circulating global media content. So I don't know that what I just said is in any way negated by Netflix problems. We're just shuffling deck chairs between different ships.
The future is now. You told me in Culture of Convergence. What is happening concrete in the sense of the your project, your new project?
Well, I mean, let's think about what I mean as the future is now. William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said the future is already happening, but it's badly distributed, which is to say that it's unequal access to the future of media. So if we look at the places where the future is already being experienced, we can begin to get insights into what media is going to look like as it becomes more widely distributed. So if I think about what's happened in media during the pandemic, I think we can get a couple of core insights. The first is that if we imagined an experiment where we knocked out a major mass media cinema for almost 2 years, and it's struggling to emerge, if we slowed down mainstream television production for most of those 2 years and paved the way for other kinds of media content to thrive, that's what we've been through. So participatory media culture, things like Twitch, things like podcasting, are emerged during this as kind of lifelines for people to connect and hold relations to each other. The debate about screen time just blew up in the sense that everything became screen time. So the idea that parents should limit access to screen time became silly and forces us to think about not screens, but what are we using screens for? Streaming services who had access to global content flows became the real success stories of the pandemic, and what I'm calling the global media shuffle we were just talking about became more and more powerful. So people were willing in desperation to start consuming or trying global media content, and they discovered they liked it. So we've accelerated about a decade's worth of change in the 2.5 years, all of which is going to shape, I think, what media looks like for the years to come. And we've accelerated as well this discussion of the metaverse and, you know, Web 3.0, cryptocurrency, NFTs, all of that's another thing that's really been emerging in recent years. Now, personally, I'm less interested in the metaverse than I am in the multiverse, by which I mean that what I'm living with right now is the Marvel Cinematic / televisual universe and the openness and fluidity of characters and stories across media platforms. This is the moment where transmedia has reached an epic scale, and I think will continue to do so. I don't see Marvel slowing down anytime soon, right? That this is the moment we're living in. And this idea of there being multiple realities manifests itself in something like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I think is the most important film so far this year, at least in the American cinema and maybe on the global scale. And partially it's the ability to play around with multiple realities easily, fluidly. I mean, it makes it look easy. It's an incredibly complex job of editing and storytelling, but we have the vocabulary to understand that. When I do a project with the Civic Imagination where I ask people to speculate from a future perspective on how in 2060 they will understand the pandemic, most people have the skills to do that. And that's in part a byproduct of the kinds of plays with realities that Marvel and other companies have been involved with in recent years. So all of that, if I'm saying, what is the future now? What the future now has been this acceleration of trends. Now, as I said, why am I less excited by metaverse? Because so far I hadn't seen anything that gets me excited. So far, what I'm seeing is a corporatized version of Second Life. And I was really excited by Second Life, but not because of the immersiveness so much as because of the grassroots building up of it. The lack of corporatization made Second Life a really interesting experiment, which ultimately failed, but produced a lot of phenomenal results in the short term. So I don't know whether metaverse will be as big as people are claiming or not. I'm a little skeptical, having been burnt on Second Life. But I do know that the multiverse is here now, is going to shape how we understand stories for the foreseeable future.
In how to us, people who produce content, how to get into this new opportunity to construct utopias, to construct new kinds of life, changing the situation of the world right now?
Well, first advice is think globally, act locally, which is to say that recognize that the media that you're producing is not just going to have an impact in Brazil, but within the world of global media shuffle will have an impact everywhere. And think then about global issues that matter. So for example, I know Brazilian authors have been very central to the solarpunk movement. And solarpunk is a genre of science fiction which seeks to imagine sustainable, environmentally sustainable futures. It is at once dystopian and utopian. Dystopian in that it imagines global climate change reaches a more dire state than it is today, but utopian in that it imagines what new solutions might emerge there, how people working together enable each other's survival, how nature and cities are more woven together in a way that feels like, frankly, Rio in particular, right, which has a more integrated relationship between the blue and the green parts of our world and the metal and concrete parts of our world. And so this is a case where this, Brazilian writers are part of a global conversation about the future, dealing with questions that are of global interest. I'm trying to remember, is it 3% the name of this Brazilian science fiction show, which has done quite well globally via Netflix, which deals with class, but also with exam regimes and educational futures. And I think it's a powerful example of a story that has a civic vision behind it that is asking questions that are global in scope and scale. Now, the economics still requires you to be locally focused, insofar as most of the money initially is going to come from your local market, not a global market. But you want to plan now for the idea that your shows could be picked up, and the ones that have more of a global reach are going to be picked up. But that does not mean global homogenization. It means you lean into the Brazilianness of your story and that what we might have called local color when we were talking about literature, the music, the fashion design. What I remember so vividly from being in Brazil was the street art, right? And the street performers. All of that becomes raw material out of which these visions of the future emerge. And, something, again, solar punk is a genre where Rio has so much to teach the rest of the world, and some of the cities elsewhere in the country as well, where, you're at the edge of the Amazon, and yet there's urban development and cultural renewal taking place. That's a story we need to think about as we think about the future.
People lost the ability to imagine the future.
Well, I think it's been severely limited, right? I think, a number of writers, Havel, for example, in Czech Republic, have noted that fascism and authoritarianism thrives by crushing the imagination, by limiting and challenging the imagination to an official state narrative. And so the imagination is endangered by the rise of these far-right governments around the planet. And we have to fight for our imagination, because Havel saw the imagination as the most important resource that allowed people to counter official narratives and to push for change. As I said, if you can't imagine what a better world looks like, you're not going to fight to achieve it. It's that simple. So this is the skill, imagination broadly understood as the skill we need to foster. Also, that imagination needs to be coupled with empathy, right? And this goes back to what you were saying about the Black maids. For much of us in the world, Brazil has been a model for a multicultural, multiracial society. And it gets a reputation for being more open to that than, in fact, some of the reality is, as you're talking about representation. So as you develop Brazilian content for a global market, I think you're going to need to lean into a more multicultural vision of society, because that's what the rest of the world wants to consume when it thinks about Brazilian content. So just as a marketing thing, it makes a lot of sense for Brazil to change that dynamic as it's being changed in many other countries around the world. It took a Black Panther for Hollywood to figure out that there were Black and brown people in other parts of the world who might like to see Black and brown people on the screen. Hopefully that insight can be shared with other creative industries around the planet, and we will end up with a more diverse and inclusive media culture.
Can you talk more about the concept of pop culturalism?
Yeah, I've been tracing this for almost 20 years, right? If you go to any elementary school in the world and look at children's art, you're going to see that it looks like manga and anime, right? If you, you can go to, for a while there, if you could go to countries that had no connections to India whatsoever, and they'd be having Bollywood film festivals. I definitely, telenovelas have developed a following globally that goes far beyond the Latin American market, because people see those stories as really important to them. And yet when Globo took me on a tour of their backlot, there were sets for other countries around the world. So Brazil was consuming telenovelas that it made for itself, but that tapped into a desire to engage with other countries, right? So everywhere we look, we are consuming each other's media, and that's just been consolidated by global streaming cultures and what I'm calling the global media shuffle.
Are the workshops only for kids, or we can engage with older generations?
No, our workshops cut across generations. So we have done workshops from middle school to senior citizens' homes, right? Wow. And I would say children definitely have a particular relationship with the workshops, and their sense of imagination is more acute. They don't need permission to play with the future. But senior citizens, on the other end, are really interested in this. No one ever asked them about the future. It's seen as indelicate, right? Because they won't live to see the future, but they care very much about the world they leave to their children and their grandchildren. And they're less inhibited about clowning around or engaging publicly with bold ideas.
Wow.
So, but we find we can make the workshops work at all age levels. And often if we go to a church, say, or we've done some in mosque, we have all of those great age levels participating at the same time. And that becomes really powerful as they learn from each other the strengths of each of those generations. So I think it's a really powerful model for transgenerational communication.
We are in the final part of the interview, so I want to ask you to tell people who are listening to your thoughts, your proposal for the world, what we as Brazilian content producers, how can we engage in your Civic Imagination project?
Well, I'm easy to reach. It's hjenkins@usc.edu. I'd love to get perspectives from people hearing this interview about what you're experiencing. We certainly could, in theory, do some of our imagination workshops in Brazil. We have a book out, Practicing Futures, which describes the workshop, has clear-cut instructions if people there wanted to run them. We're trying to recruit people to run our workshops in various parts of the world. And we believe that there's a lot of insight you will get about how the people of your country are thinking about change from doing these workshops, which are more than and different than standard focus group interviews or some of the other ways that the media industry might survey its audience in the past. This is not just about getting their reactions to your stories. It's about discovering their stories, understanding the genres they're thinking through, and beginning to craft stories that more fully address the needs and desires and fantasies of your public. And that's something that's been hard to get at in the past, but I think our workshops really do allow us a lot of depth of insights into that. So either reach out to me or get the book and start experimenting with what civic imagination workshops might mean in the context of your creative industry, in the context of your local and national media system.
So thank you very much for your participation and see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.